Hey everybody, this is Miss Rasch. We are going to do a rhetorical analysis of what to the slave is the 4th of July. I'm going to walk you through annotations, and this should help you complete the SPACECAT analysis of this text more easily. So let's get started. So first we want to talk about the background information here at the top. So on July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass addressed an audience at the Rochester, New York Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society. At a time when many people, some who were against slavery in principle, viewed the total abolition of slavery as a radical cause, Douglass pulled no punches in pleading his case. So there's a few things in the background that we need to take time to point out. First off, this gives us context for our rhetorical analysis. It tells us the time. Okay, so we have a whole date right here, July 5th, 1852. Tells us when this is happening. 1852 is prior to the Civil War, so the North and South haven't gone to war yet, but people are already trying to eliminate slavery. It's also important to note that it is July 5th that he's giving this speech, which is following what holiday? It's in the title, the 4th of July. And what do we celebrate on the 4th of July? Our national independence, our freedom, to make it simple. So this also helps us identify the exigence, what was the spark behind why Frederick Douglass gave this speech. He was prompted by the 4th of July holiday, celebrations of freedom, okay. All right. So moving on from that, we do have our speaker's name. So you can highlight that if you like. So we have Frederick Douglass is our speaker. Who is he addressing? He's addressing an audience, keyword, right? Audience, at the Rochester, New York Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society. So this is the audience here. So take a note off to the side. That is our audience. We're explicitly told who our audience is and the location that they are in. All right, so that's everything from the background. So let's get into the speech. Paragraph 1. Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? Am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? There's a little bit in here, okay? So first, we want to point out the punctuation on all these sentences, okay? He asks a bunch of rhetorical questions. So you can take a note about just one of them. Rhetorical questions. So that's going to help you answer the choice part of SPACECAT. That's one of the things in here. We want to point out the things that he says, or those I represent. He also mentions us in 2 places. Let me underline us so that it stands out a bit more. So we're circling that, us, and then we have us. All of these things, this one, and this one, they all point to African Americans. Okay. Or slaves, because that is how most African Americans were at the time. He is speaking to them, a little bit of background on the speaker. So Douglas, Douglas was formerly enslaved. Okay, so that's a little bit of background for our speaker part for SPACECAT. He was formerly enslaved, and he's speaking about African Americans and slaves as a formerly enslaved man, as one in the community. Okay, he's specifically mentioning the Declaration of Independence. Okay, that ties into his exigence, right? Because the Declaration of Independence is supposed to grant freedom. And the ironic part is that it doesn't grant freedom to all Americans, and he'll get more into that later. This also sets up, this also is the beginning of his use of paradox, okay? He talks about the joyous celebration of freedom versus, so paradox is contrasting ideas, versus the harsh reality of those still enslaved. So he's saying, why am I here to talk? Like, I get that you're all happy, but I can't be happy because while you're joyous, there are still people that are enslaved and living in this harsh reality. Okay? All right. So moving on to paragraph 2. Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light and my burden easy and delightful. For who is there so cold that a nation's sympathy could not warm him? Who so obdurate and dead to the claims of gratitude that would not thankfully acknowledge such a priceless benefits? Who so stolid and selfish that would not give his voice to swell the hallelujahs of a nation's jubilee, when the chains of servitude have been torn from his limbs? I am not that man. In a case like that, the dumb might eloquently speak, and the lame man leap as a hart. Okay, so going back to that beginning of that paragraph, a few things we want to do. Take note of his use. He points out in this paragraph saying what he's saying. If only I had happy answers to those questions, we could all be joyful. So if he could give positive and happy answers to those questions that he asked in paragraph 1, then everyone could be happy together instead of just those that are actually free, right? He mentions a few vocab words: obdurate, which means resistant to persuasion; stolid, which is feeling little or no emotion. That stolid ties back to our word cold here. So cold can be taken to mean heartless in this context. So for who is there so heartless that a nation's sympathy could not warm him or make him care? He talks about the hallelujahs of a nation's jubilee. Okay, we have that little guide there to go to the footnotes. Okay, so pointing out that he praises God at the time of celebrating a national anniversary. So, you know, he's pointing out his religious points of view there. He also uses the word acknowledge. And what he means, acknowledge the benefits of the Declaration. I'm just going to say Declaration of Independence to all men. And then all is important because that was the point there. So acknowledge the benefits of the Declaration to all men, and not just like regular benefits, but priceless benefits, right? Okay. All right. Second page here. So I want to take a moment and point out that all, right? All those who are free should celebrate and rejoice. Oops. But while he's free to an extent, not all men are. So he is not that man, right? Who so stolid and selfish would not give his voice to swell the hallelujahs of the nation's jubilee when the chains of servitude have been torn from his limbs? So, again, another rhetorical question here. Okay, I am not that man. In a case like that, the dumb might eloquently speak, and the lame man leap like a hart. This part here, you'll notice it's in quotes. You have a reference to the footnotes at the bottom. This is a use of allusion to the Bible. Okay, that will help you when you are filling out the choice portion of your SPACECAT form. And then building on the rest of this thought, okay, when he says in a case like that, but not all are free to enjoy the benefits of the Declaration of Independence, including myself. Because while Frederick Douglass is technically a free man, meaning he's not enslaved, he does not have all the same rights as other white men or other men in general in the country. Okay? Paragraph 3. But such is not the state of the case. I say it with a sad sense of disparity, there's another vocab word, between us. I am not included within the pale, glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. So I'm going to pause there. I am not included within the pale of glorious anniversary. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. Okay? The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you and not by me. Bequeathed, you might want to put a box around so that you can look at the footnotes down at the bottom. Bequeathed, it just means handed down by your fathers to you. All of these things that we pointed out here, okay, all of these things are pointing out that disparity, right? That great difference of inequality. Blacks are not equal or all free. Pointing out the obvious, but he's getting to the point. The sunlight that brought light and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters, there's a footnote down there, but I'm just going to make a quick note that means chains. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, fellow citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? Another rhetorical question there. Few things we want to point out here. So the temple, the grand illuminated temple of liberty. Okay. What's another word for liberty? Freedom. Right? Liberty equals freedom. Okay. The grand illuminated temple of liberty. Okay. He's saying this is inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Okay. Sacrilegious just means making fun of something sacred. Okay. And to him, point out extreme disrespect to something sacred. That is what sacrilegious means. And he's specifically talking about freedom. Complete disrespect to freedom, to liberty. Okay? It's sacrilegious irony to boast about your liberty while you're also keeping people enslaved. Okay? Moving on, paragraph 4. It's a long one. All right, so, fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, you might want to put a box around tumultuous if that's unfamiliar, but that's a big ruckus. Above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. If I do forget, if I do not faithfully remember those bleeding children of sorrow this day, may my right hand forget her cunning and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. So, let's start there. This quote here, you'll notice the little footnote. It is referring back to a biblical passage of Psalm 137. So this is another example of allusion. Okay. We also have this repeated passage, if I do. Okay. These are an example of anaphora, where you begin successive clauses with the same words. So, anaphora. Allusion. So, moving on. To forget them, to pass lightly over their wrongs, and to chime in with the popular theme would be treason most scandalous and shocking, and would make me a reproach before God and the world. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view. All right, so going back, we have another example of anaphora with the repeated beginning of to used over and over and over again. So anaphora. Okay, if you are unfamiliar with what reproach means, basically, I'm going to take a note over here. Reproach means a disappointment. Well, a great disappointment, really, not just a disappointment. Running out of room on my page. He continues on to say, and this is important, my subject then, fellow Americans, is slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view. So the slave's point of view, right? This is our main idea. Okay, this is like the main point that he's going to make from here on out. Standing there, identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine, I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character of conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. So he says blacker here. What can we understand blacker to mean? It has a figurative meaning, so it can be tragic, evil, wicked. So blacker in this context means any of those things. It's never looked more tragic or evil to me or wicked to me than on this 4th of July. Okay? Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. Equally hideous and revolting, building on that idea of being tragic and evil or wicked. We don't usually describe things of tragedy or wickedness as being beautiful, right? They're usually hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. As long, this is what this means, as long as there is slavery in America, she is a lie unto herself. So, America being, quote unquote, the land of the free, is not truly the land of the free. It is false to the past, false to the present, and will be false in the future if we do not allow freedom to exist for all people. America will be a lie to herself. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call into question and denounce, there's another vocabulary word. Denounce just means to criticize harshly. Denounce with all the emphasis I can command everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. Equivocate means using vague or unclear language. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice, or who is not at heart a slaveholder, shall not confess to be right and just. Okay, so we want to go back to this crushed and bleeding slave. Okay. Running out of space. This is a use of imagery. Crushed and bleeding. Those are very imaginative words. Like you can just picture someone being like crushed and bleeding. So that's imagery. We have examples here of personification. So in the name of humanity, which is outraged, or sorry, circled the wrong thing. So two things. So we have a repetition here, in the name, in the name, in the name. So all of those repetitions of in the name, that creates parallelism. Okay, so parallelism in the name. So I remember exactly what I'm talking about there. And then here's our example of personification. So humanity, which is outraged, liberty, which is fettered. These are both examples of personification. Because can humanity as an entity, I guess, which is outraged, liberty, which is fettered, so freedom, can it really be chained up? Personification, giving unhuman things human traits. So we talked about denounce, we talked about equivocate. Okay. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me, that any man whose judgment is not binded by prejudice, or who is not a slaveholder at heart, shall not confess to be right and just. So all righteous will argue and then unless, okay, it's also saying unless you support slavery, you will agree with my harsh criticisms and words. All right. So whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice, or who is not at heart a slaveholder, shall not confess to be right and just. So all the righteous will argue with him that slavery is wrong. Unless you support slavery, you will agree with me and my harsh criticisms and words. Because he's saying a lot of pretty straightforward and harsh things to these people. All right. So paragraph 5. But I fancy I hear some one of my audience say, it is just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists fail to make a favorable impression on the public mind. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Your cause would be much more likely to succeed. But I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. Pause there. Okay, we have a few words that maybe need defining. Denounce. What does denounce mean? It means to publicly, and that's important, publicly declare evil or wrongdoing. Or inform against it. So he's going to speak out against what he sees as wrong and evil. Okay? He's trying to persuade. He's trying to argue. Okay? Rebuke means to criticize. All right? he also says there's nothing to be argued. Why do I need to argue or persuade more? There's nothing to be argued. We can all agree that slavery is wrong. Okay? What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue? There's another rhetorical question. On what branch of the subjects do the people of this country need light? Okay? So, need light. What's he saying there? Enlightenment. What does enlightenment mean? What does it mean to be enlightened? Educated, right? Okay. So in what branch of the subject do people need to be educated? Do people need to be informed? Like, what more do they need to know to understand that slavery is wrong? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? That point is conceded already. So conceded, admitted, right? Nobody doubts it. The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of their laws for their government. Okay? Nobody doubts it. The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of their government. Okay? So they acknowledge what? What's it? That the slave is a man. Right? He's getting a little bit ahead of his argument here, but he says that nobody doubts that the slave is a man. Okay? He goes on to point out specific laws. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience. So laws is important. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slaves. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia which, if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he be, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? So, they acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. So, disobedience, the slave, okay? This, from here, from there, all the way through to punishment. That whole section talks about its ethos, his credibility as a former slave and understanding the law, okay? It's unfair. Path or logos is also used here when he talks about the laws. He points out specific laws. He's citing specific evidence. Okay? He goes on to say the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being. Okay? It's important to note only humans can be these things. Animals, beasts of the field, etc., they do not reason like humans do. They're not considered intellectual or moral creatures. Okay? The manhood of the slave is conceded. It is admitted in the fact that the Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read or write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue that the manhood of the slave. So he specifically points out severe fines for teaching the slave to read or write. Okay? And then he goes on to ask the question, or to make the statement rather, that when you can point to any laws that will punish someone for teaching an animal to read or write, then I'll argue the manhood of the slave. But until you can tell me a law that will punish someone for teaching an animal to read or write, we have no argument here. Okay? So, again, logos, logical, right? This is also another example of paradox. When he says, when you can point to any such laws in reference to beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. He's saying like opposite things to prove a point. When the dogs in your streets, when the fowls of the air, when the cattle on your hills, when the fish of the sea, and the reptiles that crawl shall be unable to distinguish the slave from a brute, then I will argue with you that the slave is a man. So brute simply means animal. Okay? This whole section is also example of paradox. And here he's saying, to put it in more modern words if you need it, when animals of the earth see the slaves as one of their own, then I will argue about the slave being a man. Okay. When laws punish animals for the same crimes as slaves, when laws punish animals for the same crimes as slaves, then he will argue the manhood of a slave. So, basic summary for that paragraph. So as soon as the animals are punished like the slaves are, then we can talk about whether or not the slave is a man. Because people are justifying slavery by saying that they are equal to the animals of the field, which justifies them owning them like you would own the animals of the field, right? So paragraph 6. For the present, it is enough to affirm the equal manhood of the Negro race. It is not astonishing that while we are plowing, planting, and reaping, using all kinds of mechanical tools, erecting houses, constructing bridges, building ships, working in metals of brass, iron, copper, silver, and gold, that while we are reading, writing, and ciphering using math, arithmetic, acting as clerks, merchants, secretaries, having among us lawyers, doctors, ministers, poets, authors, editors, orators, and teachers, that while we are engaged in all manner of enterprises common to other men, digging gold in California, capturing the whale in the Pacific, feeding the sheep and cattle on the hillside, living, moving, acting, thinking, planning, living in families as husbands, wives, and children, and above all, confessing and worshiping the Christian's God, and looking hopefully for life and immortality beyond the grave, we are called upon to prove that we are men. So I wanted to specifically point out, we are engaged in all manner of enterprises common to other men. Why are we even questioning that slaves are men when we are doing all the same things that all other men of different races are currently doing that aren't being called into question for their manhood, right? We're doing all the same things. We have an example here: living, moving, acting, thinking, planning. So this ing repetition here that we see in these words, that's alliteration. Okay? He also points out, he's being very sarcastic here, which is an example of verbal irony. Okay? So while we're doing all these things, we're called upon to prove that we're men. Like, how ironic. We do all these same things and we're supposed to prove that we're men. Like, this is effective sarcasm here. So slaves do all the same things you, meaning whites, do, and yet we have to prove ourselves to be human. Okay? Like, what the heck? Why? Paragraph 7. Would you have me argue that a man is entitled to liberty? That he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is that a question for Republicans? So Republicans here, it's important to know, he's not talking about Republicans versus Democrats like we would think in modern language. Republicans, by definition, because if you think of history, we are a Republican government, meaning referring to all citizens in the U.S. So a republic government is one whose people elect representatives. To govern them. So when he's saying, is that a question for Republicans? He doesn't mean like Republicans like we think of them now. He means, is that really a question that we need to ask free citizens who elect their representatives? Like, do we really need to ask this? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation as a matter beset with great difficulty, involving a doubtful application of the principle of justice, hard to be understood? Just gonna make another note, more rhetorical questions. I've been just circling them as we go. Okay. How should I look today in the presence of Americans dividing and subdividing a discourse to show that men have a natural right to freedom? Okay, natural right to freedom. That's from our Declaration of Independence. It's that God-given right, right? Speaking of it relatively and positively, negatively and affirmatively, to do so would make myself ridiculous and to offer an insult to your understanding. There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him. There it is. Everyone knows slavery is wrong, okay? All men inherently know slavery is wrong. It would be ridiculous to argue the virtue in enslaving anyone. Okay? It'd be ridiculous to argue that there's any virtue, any good in enslaving anybody. What am I to argue? That it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow men, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at the auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their masters? Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employment for my time and the strength of such arguments, for my time and strength than such arguments would imply. So, just to summarize what he's saying in this whole paragraph, these are all examples of things that are done to slaves at the time. Okay? So rhetorical question, but also another point of verbal irony. Must I argue? No, like this is ridiculous. Okay? What then remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine? That God did not establish it? That our doctors of divinity are mistaken? There is blasphemy in the thought. That which is inhuman cannot be divine. Who can reason on such a proposition? They that can may. I cannot. The time for such argument is past. Slavery is not divine. God did not establish it. So he's making a biblical argument here, because keep in mind he's talking to a bunch of God-fearing Christians, right? Doctors of divinity are mistaken. So doctors of divinity, what do you think a doctor of divinity is? A priest, pastor, bishop, etc. Okay, the Pope, right? Doctors of divinity, the ones who supposedly know God's law best, right? That which is inhuman cannot be divine. Okay? So men are created, this is what's implied, in God's image and are therefore divinely created. Equally created is also the point, right? A man is a man, regardless of what color he is, right? So, more irony here. Moving on. Time has passed. We've already established that the slave, oh my gosh, I need to make it so you can read it. I'm sorry. The slave is a man and therefore divine. Okay? Man is divine. So paragraph 10. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would, today, pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feelings of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. All right. So, scorching irony. He's got to pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule. Blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, stern rebuke. Okay? So all of these things here, imagery, right? These are all things that he's doing here. He's describing what he's doing. He's pouring out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. These are all the things that he's doing in this speech. Okay? For it is not light that is needed, but fire. Let me do a little squiggly line under this. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. Okay? So these are all allegory. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation, propriety meaning the behavior that is considered socially acceptable, must be startled. Hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. Okay? So, more examples of personification and anaphora. Oops. In the way that he's repeating himself, giving the nation features, conscience, nation as a conscience, etc. All those human features. All right, paragraph 11 is another example of paradox, like the whole thing, okay? We'll point that out right at the beginning, okay? What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. See, that's pretty important stuff there. On this day, it is so much more stark that slaves are the constant victim, because now you're celebrating. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are, to him, a mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Ooh, that's those harsh words that he was promising. Blasting reproach and stern rebuke. There it is. So, celebration is a sham, boasted liberty, unholy license. National greatness is swelling vanity. Okay? The sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Okay? Your shouts of equality, of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. mockery to those not yet free. Definitely mockery. Okay. He talks down here. He mentions bombast. If you don't know what bombast means, all talk, no action. So they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. All right. Fraud, deception, impiety. Impiety is the lack of respect for God. So again, going back to paragraph 9, going back to all of his religious argument. Okay. It is a disrespect to God to celebrate. It is hypocritical to celebrate freedom of a nation, to call yourself a free nation when not everybody is free. Okay? And all these things are a thin veil to cover up the crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. So a nation of savages, of people who are not civilized. Even what you're doing here would be disgraceful to those who are not civilized. This would be disgraceful. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking than the United States at this very hour. That is important. Okay? He's calling everybody out. All right. We made it. Our last paragraph. Allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened, and the doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope. While drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions, my spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. So his tone shifts here. That's important to note. Okay? He goes from upset, angry, frustrated, and anything like that you can think of, to hopeful. Okay? So this is where the tone shifts here. So notwithstanding the dark picture I have presented, I do not despair of this country. Another example of paradox. Okay. There is darkness, but I have hope. And see the coming light. Right? The arm of the Lord is not shortened. Illusion again. And the doom of slavery is certain. See, there's that hope. Doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence. The great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions. My spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. So he can see society moving in the right direction. Okay? the founding fathers were inspired when they wrote the Declaration and set up the country. Okay. So hopefully this helps. If you took the notes as you should have, you will be able to complete your SPACECAT worksheet more easily. I pointed out a lot of different pieces of evidence that you can use. So if you need to go back and watch it again, please watch it. But good luck. This was Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July.